The Fake Divorce, A Husband's Journey Through Betrayal. Henry sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee, the warm sunlight filtering through the windows of their home. He had always considered himself a lucky man. He had Ellen, a wife he adored and respected, a woman who, to him, embodied everything a person could want in a partner. Their life together was easy, filled with laughter, shared goals, and a quiet understanding that their love was unshakable. 7 years of marriage had passed, and in that time, they built a life together, one filled with dreams of traveling, starting a family, and eventually growing old side by side. Their home was their sanctuary, a beautiful 2-story house with a garden out back and a cozy fireplace that crackled during the colder months. On the outside, their life looked perfect. It was everything Henry had ever wanted. Ellen was everything he had hoped for: smart, beautiful, kind, and hard-working. She had a successful career, just like him, and while they worked long hours, they made it a point to spend quality time together when they could. Whether it was cooking dinner together, watching their favorite TV shows, or simply talking about their day, their connection always felt strong, genuine. But recently, something had changed. It was subtle at first, something that didn't raise any immediate alarms but planted a seed of doubt in Henry's mind. He noticed how Ellen's laughter didn't come as easily, how she spent more time on her phone than she had before, her eyes often glued to the screen, her conversations with him fewer and fewer. At first, he assumed it was just work stress. Ellen had been busy, and their professional lives were demanding. He tried to reassure himself that this was just a phase, that things would return to normal once the stress of her project subsided. But the distance between them began to grow. She came home late from work more often, and when she did, her demeanor was cold. It wasn't as though she was being outright rude or dismissive, it was more that she seemed emotionally unavailable, as though a part of her was already somewhere else. One night, as they were eating dinner in silence, Henry couldn't ignore it anymore. He set his fork down, staring at her across the table. "Ellen, are you all right? You've seemed distant lately. Is there something going on?" She paused, looking at him with a strained smile. "I'm just tired, Henry. You know how it is. Work is crazy right now. But I'm fine." Her response wasn't convincing. He had heard her say that before, yet it felt different this time. She wasn't the woman he had married. She wasn't the woman he knew. The next evening, as they sat on the couch, Ellen looked at him with an odd glint in her eyes. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe we should get a fake divorce. Just for financial reasons, of course." Henry blinked, confused. "What do you mean? A fake divorce?" Ellen nodded, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair. "It could help with tax benefits, and some of the other financial stuff. It's just a formality. We don't need to actually separate, but we could work the system to our advantage." Henry stared at her, unsure how to react. The idea felt foreign, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if she was joking. But the seriousness in her tone told him otherwise. "I'm not sure I get it," he said slowly. "It seems odd." She reached over, taking his hand in hers. "I know it sounds strange, but trust me on this one. It could really help us." Despite his reservations, Henry nodded. He trusted her. Maybe it was a crazy idea, but if Ellen thought it was worth it, maybe he should go along with it. What harm could it really do? He wanted to believe in her, to trust that she had his best interests at heart. As the conversation shifted, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But for now, he would let it slide. He hoped that whatever it was, it would soon pass. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of the unraveling of his perfect marriage. Days passed, and Henry went along with Ellen's suggestion of the fake divorce, albeit with lingering uncertainty. It seemed like such an unusual idea, one that didn't make sense to him at first, but he convinced himself it must have some merit. Ellen was smart, pragmatic, and always had a plan for everything. She wouldn't suggest something that could harm them. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. However, the more time that passed, the more the tension between them deepened. Ellen continued to become more distant, and Henry felt the strain even in the small moments. Her phone was never far from her, and when she received messages or calls, she'd always step away, making excuses. "Work stuff," she'd say, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, before disappearing into another room. Henry never questioned her at first, it seemed like normal behavior. But the longer it went on, the more it felt like he was being kept at arm's length, like there was an invisible wall between them. It was the little things, too. Their conversations had grown shorter, and when they did talk, there was no spark, no joy. He found himself initiating most of their interactions, but Ellen's responses were mechanical, as if she was just going through the motions. The warmth they once shared seemed to fade into something distant and cold. Henry tried to convince himself it was just a phase. Ellen was under pressure at work, and maybe she was simply overwhelmed. But when he asked her about it, she brushed off his concerns as if they were nothing. "I'm fine, really," she insisted, offering a reassuring smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a lot on my plate right now." But that didn't explain the increasing number of late nights. At first, it seemed like an innocent explanation: late meetings, work deadlines, nothing to worry about. But then it became a routine. She would leave the house after dinner, her phone always in hand. He'd wait up for her, half expecting her to come back early, but she never did. One evening, when Henry was alone in the living room, he heard the familiar sound of Ellen's phone pinging. She'd left it on the counter, and the screen lit up, revealing a string of texts from someone named Chris. His heart skipped a beat, and an uneasy feeling crept up his spine. He glanced at the time. Ellen hadn't been home yet, and she was supposed to have been back an hour ago. Curiosity gnawed at him. He told himself he shouldn't look. Trust was essential in any marriage, and he didn't want to be the kind of man who invaded his wife's privacy. But something in him couldn't stop. Slowly, he picked up her phone and unlocked it. His fingers trembled as he scrolled through the messages, heart pounding in his chest. The texts were harmless at first, simple and friendly, but then there was one that caught his eye. "I can't stop thinking about you. I miss you already." Henry's breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a physical blow, his mind racing to process what he was reading. Ellen had always been careful with her words, but now, it was clear that something far deeper was happening between her and Chris. The sick feeling in his stomach intensified as he read more, each message confirming his worst fears. He set the phone down, a wave of dizziness washing over him. His mind screamed at him to understand, to make sense of this betrayal. But nothing made sense. Ellen had been acting strange, but this? It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Henry's heart leaped into his throat. Ellen had returned, her steps hesitant as she entered the living room. She froze when she saw him, his face pale and tight with emotion. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick with tension, and Henry could barely keep his composure. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to get stuck. Finally, he found his voice. "Ellen," he said, his tone low but filled with quiet rage. "Who's Chris?" Her face turned pale, and her lips parted as if to say something. But she couldn't. The truth was already written in her silence. Ellen's eyes darted nervously toward the phone on the counter, her face a mask of guilt. Henry's heart pounded as he stood frozen in place, every ounce of him wanting to shout, to demand answers, but something held him back. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air heavy with the weight of what he was about to hear. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Henry stood still, waiting, his breath shallow as he tried to process the storm swirling inside him. Ellen was supposed to be his wife, his partner, the one person he could trust above all others. And yet here he was, standing in front of her, holding the evidence of her betrayal. "Ellen," he repeated, his voice trembling with emotion. "Who is Chris?" She looked at him, her face flushed with guilt and shame. She bit her lip, clearly struggling to find the right words. But in that moment, Henry knew the truth already. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach: she had been having an affair. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry, I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. I'm so sorry." Her words were empty to him, hollow. He had never imagined hearing her say something like this, especially not after everything they had shared. The trust they'd built over the years now felt like a shattered glass, impossible to put back together. "Sorry?" Henry's voice cracked as he said the word, his chest tightening. "You're sorry? For what, Ellen? For betraying me? For sneaking around behind my back?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not like that, I swear. I never meant to hurt you. But things have been different between us for a while now. I felt so distant, and Chris, he was there for me. He made me feel seen, Henry." The words stung, each one like a blade to his heart. "Distant," he echoed, his anger and confusion rising. "You were distant because of him, weren't you? You were pulling away from me to be with him." Ellen looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I didn't want this to happen. It just what?" Henry cut her off, his voice rising in disbelief. "You just decided to have an affair and justify it by saying you felt neglected? What about me, Ellen? What about us?" The room felt like it was closing in on him. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had spent years building a life with, had completely betrayed him. And now she was trying to make excuses, to downplay the hurt she had caused. His head spun, the reality of it all settling like a weight in his chest. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Henry. I thought if I told you, you'd leave. I thought I could fix it without ruining everything. But I was wrong. I should have been honest with you from the start." Henry's heart ached at her words, but he couldn't reconcile them with what had actually happened. How could he ever trust her again? How could he ever believe that anything between them had been real if she had been lying to him this whole time? "Ellen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You lied to me. You lied about everything. All these months, I thought we were fine. But I was living in a lie. You're telling me now that you've been seeing him behind my back?" She nodded, a single tear falling down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Henry. I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been seeing Chris for almost 6 months now." The words hit him like a freight train. 6 months. She had been hiding this for half a year. How many times had they shared a laugh, a kiss, an intimate moment, while she was secretly carrying on with another man? The betrayal felt deeper than he could have ever imagined. A cold, bitter rage began to build inside him, but alongside it was a sense of profound sadness. How could everything they had built be reduced to this? Henry felt like he was drowning in the realization that his marriage, his life, had been a lie. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Henry asked, his voice breaking as the full weight of the situation crashed over him. "Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me when things weren't right?" Ellen opened her mouth as though she were going to speak, but the words never came. She simply lowered her head, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with guilt. Henry stood there, staring at her in silence. The silence was deafening, filled only with the sound of his own pulse ringing in his ears. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, it all swirled inside him, making him feel like he was on the verge of falling apart. But instead of breaking down, something inside him hardened. The woman he had loved was no longer the person standing in front of him. The truth had been revealed, and it was more painful than anything he could have imagined. He didn't know what to say or do next. But he knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the room was thick with tension as Henry stood facing Ellen, the weight of the past few minutes pressing down on him like a heavy stone. His thoughts were a tangled mess: shock, betrayal, anger, each emotion crashing against the next. Ellen's tears fell freely, but to Henry, they felt hollow, meaningless. It wasn't that he didn't care, it was that it all seemed so unreal. He didn't know what he was supposed to feel anymore, or even how to respond. His entire world had been turned upside down. Ellen's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Henry, please. I never wanted to hurt you like this. I thought we were losing each other, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to tell you." Henry took a step back, his face hardening as he shook his head. "You thought this was the answer?" He gestured to the distance that had grown between them, but now it felt more like an insurmountable chasm. "You think betraying me, lying to me, is what we needed? To fix things?" Ellen wiped her eyes, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. I was so scared, Henry." "Scared?" Henry repeated bitterly. "You were scared? You think that justifies everything? You think that justifies throwing away what we had for a fling with some guy?" Her face flushed crimson, and she opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The reality of her actions hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Henry ran his hand through his hair in frustration, his voice shaking with emotion. "We were supposed to be partners. We were supposed to be in this together. And you just threw it all away. All of it. For what? For him?" Ellen closed her eyes, unable to look at him. She was broken, Henry could see that. But the feeling that surged through him wasn't empathy, it was anger. Raw, suffocating anger. He had never imagined that this would happen. He had never imagined that he would stand here, looking at the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted, and see nothing but a stranger. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered again, but Henry could feel the distance growing between them with every word she said. "And yet you did." Henry's voice cracked with the weight of the realization. "You hurt me, Ellen. And now you want to act like it's all going to be okay?" The silence in the room stretched on, deafening. Henry stood there, his hands shaking, his pulse roaring in his ears. He couldn't escape the image of her, crying in front of him, yet it felt so distant, like he was watching it unfold through a glass wall. There was a part of him that wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her that everything would be all right, but he couldn't. Not after what she had done. "I don't know what to do, Henry," she said softly, finally looking up at him. "I can't undo the past. I can't take back what happened. I don't know if I can forgive you," Henry whispered, his throat tight. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Those words hung in the air like a final verdict. There was no going back from this. The foundation of their marriage had crumbled, and Henry wasn't sure how, or if, it could be rebuilt. He took a step back, running his fingers over his face as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare, it was his reality. His heart was breaking, piece by piece, and he didn't know how to stop it. Ellen reached out to him, her hand trembling, but he recoiled, his eyes blazing with hurt. "Don't touch me." Her face crumpled with the rejection, and Henry saw her sadness, her guilt, but none of it mattered. None of it could erase what had happened. The woman who had promised to stand by him, to share everything with him, had broken him. And now, there was nothing left to hold on to. "I need time, Ellen," he said quietly, his voice distant, like he was speaking from a place far away. "I need time to think. I can't do this right now." He turned to walk out of the room, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. Ellen's sobs echoed in the silence, but Henry didn't stop. There was no turning back now. What they once had was gone, and whatever came next, it wouldn't be the same. As he stepped out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him, Henry leaned against the wall, his body shaking. The anger had subsided, but the emptiness remained. The world around him felt like it was spinning, everything unfamiliar and distorted. He had no idea what he was supposed to do now. The days after the confrontation felt like a blur. Henry's life, once so certain and stable, was now filled with confusion, self-doubt, and anger. Every inch of their home, every room, reminded him of the life he thought he had. It felt like a cruel joke, as if someone had taken everything he knew and twisted it beyond recognition. Ellen remained in their bedroom, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal. Henry slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of being near her. Every time he saw her face, every time their eyes met, all he could think about was the deceit, the lies she had woven, the affair she had hidden. His mind raced constantly, questions spinning without answers. Could he forgive her? Was reconciliation even possible? Or had the damage been done beyond repair? He tried to keep himself busy with work, hoping that somehow the routine would help him regain control, but it didn't. He couldn't focus, couldn't find peace in the distractions. The truth was always there, lingering, gnawing at him. He could feel the weight of it like a suffocating presence, impossible to escape. Ellen had apologized countless times since that night, but her words, as heartfelt as they seemed, felt hollow. Henry couldn't bring himself to trust her again, not yet, maybe not ever. Each apology only served to remind him of the pain she had caused. It was late one night when Henry found himself sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at the framed picture of the two of them that still stood on the nightstand. He traced the edges of the photo with his finger, remembering how happy they once were. That moment, that frozen smile in the picture, felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. The man in that photo, the man who had believed in their love, seemed like a stranger to him now. His thoughts drifted to the conversation they had months ago, the one in which Ellen had suggested they get a fake divorce for financial reasons. At the time, it had sounded so absurd, yet, as the weeks passed, Henry had begun to see how much of it had been a cover for something else. A part of him had always felt like something wasn't right, but he hadn't been willing to see it. Now, the reality was impossible to ignore. Ellen had manipulated him, and it wasn't just about money, it was about keeping her affair hidden. Henry clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar knot of betrayal tighten in his stomach. He had trusted her, blindly, fully. And now? Now, everything he had believed in felt like a lie. He thought about Chris. The man who had stolen Ellen from him, who had filled the space that should have been Henry's. What kind of man was he? Was he just a temporary distraction, or did he truly have feelings for her? Henry's mind flitted between anger and despair. The questions would never have answers, and even if they did, would it really change anything? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Ellen standing in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. She hadn't been able to sleep either. She had come to him more than once over the past few days, pleading for forgiveness, but Henry was not ready to hear her. He wasn't ready to make any decisions. The wound was still too fresh, the pain too raw. Henry, her voice broke slightly. I can't keep doing this. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was, but please, let me prove to you that I can be the woman you married. I want to fight for us, if you're willing. For a long moment, Henry said nothing. He stared at her, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to reach out to her, to embrace her and say it would be okay, that they could move past this. But another part of him, the part that had been broken, was afraid. Afraid of being hurt again, afraid of the vulnerability that would come with trusting her after everything that had happened. Ellen, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if we can fix this. You lied to me, you betrayed me. And right now, I don't know how to look at you and see anything other than the woman who hurt me." Ellen's face crumpled as if his words physically hit her. She stepped closer, but Henry shook his head. He couldn't be touched right now. He needed space. He needed time to think. "I need time, Ellen," he said, his voice firm but pained. "I can't make any decisions right now. I need to figure out if I can even be in the same room with you without this overwhelming feeling of betrayal. I need to know if I can ever look at you the same way again." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I'll give you the time you need, Henry. I don't want to lose you. I'll wait for you, however long it takes. But please know that I love you. And I'm truly sorry." With that, she turned and left, leaving Henry to sit in silence, his heart torn between wanting to repair their marriage and the part of him that feared he could never trust her again. As the door clicked shut behind her, Henry finally let out a deep breath, his mind still spinning with questions and doubts. He didn't have the answers. Not yet. But one thing was clear: whatever happened next, he was going to have to decide whether the love they had was worth fighting for or whether it was better to walk away and heal. The days blurred into one another, an endless cycle of questions and restless nights. Henry couldn't remember the last time he had truly slept. Every time he closed his eyes, the images of Ellen's betrayal flashed in his mind, her secretive behavior, the look in her eyes when he confronted her, the brokenness in her voice as she begged for forgiveness. But along with that, he couldn't help but remember the good times, the laughter, the plans they had made for the future. Those memories felt like another lifetime now. One evening, after a long day at work, Henry returned to the house to find Ellen sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't left the house in days, and neither had he, both of them trapped in the uncomfortable limbo of their fractured marriage. The tension between them was unbearable, but still, neither had made a move to leave. She had given him the space he asked for, but Henry could feel the weight of the silence between them. "Henry," Ellen said softly as he entered, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I know you're still hurting. I understand if you need more time, but I can't keep living like this. I don't want to lose you. I need to know if there's a chance for us." Her words hit Henry like a wave, sweeping away the carefully constructed wall he had built around his heart. He had been so focused on his pain, so consumed by the hurt she had caused, that he hadn't fully considered what it would mean to forgive her, or whether he could even do it. But now, in the quiet of the room, with her voice breaking the silence, he realized something. Something that terrified him. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her. Not yet. But deep down, he knew that what they had was worth fighting for, worth trying to rebuild, even if it meant facing the hardest truths about himself and their marriage. Henry took a seat across from her, his chest tight with emotion. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice low, steady. "And I don't have all the answers yet, Ellen. I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before. But I can't keep living like this either. We can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." Ellen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight. I want a chance, Henry. Please." The desperation in her voice echoed in his mind, but Henry knew something fundamental had shifted inside him. Trust had been shattered, and healing wasn't something that could happen with just a few words. But it was also clear that his heart wasn't completely closed off to the idea of rebuilding. He loved her. He still loved her. And that love, though fractured, was a foundation he wasn't willing to let go of just yet. "I'm not promising that things will go back to how they were," Henry said, his voice tinged with both sadness and hope. "I don't know if I can ever feel the same way about you. But I'm willing to try. I want to figure out if we can move forward together, if we can rebuild the trust that's been broken." But it's going to take time. It's going to take work. From both of us. Ellen's face softened, the faintest glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Henry. I know I've hurt you, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm here. And I'm ready to fight for us, if you'll let me. For a long moment, Henry simply stared at her, the silence stretching between them. The decision had been made, whether he was fully ready for it or not. He was willing to try. He was willing to fight for what they had, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be. I'm not going to pretend that this is easy, he said, his voice steady. But I'm willing to try. For us. For what we had. We'll take it one day at a time, Ellen. That's all I can promise. Ellen nodded, her shoulders sagging in relief. She wiped the tears from her face and gave him a small, hopeful smile. One day at a time, she repeated. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for giving me that chance. As she reached out to him, Henry hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with difficult conversations and painful realizations. But for the first time since the affair had come to light, Henry felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in days, hope. They still had a long way to go. But they were both willing to walk that path together, if they could. And that, for now, was enough. The decision to move forward with Ellen was not an easy one, but it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take time, effort, and a lot of work. Henry knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that the journey of healing had already begun. Whether they would ultimately find a way back to the love they had before, or whether they would part ways, only time would tell. But for now, Henry had made his choice. He would take the first step towards rebuilding what had been broken. And that, in itself, was a victory. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share your own experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping, real-life inspired stories.